Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. Today's lecture is going to cover a pretty short period from 1940 to 1948. It's a period where Democratic candidates win all the presidential elections, but it's also a time of some pronounced electoral fluctuations, at least in the House and Senate races. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, 1936, when Roosevelt won his second term, things were looking better in the U.S. economy. Unemployment was down, production was up. But in 37, the next year, there's another economic downturn and an upsurge in unemployment, quite concerning considering how deep the Depression was. Quite a few economists think that Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually prolonged the Depression through his policies. Many view them as too sort of anti-business. It's controversial. There are big debates about this, and I'm not going to get into those debates, but it is a possibility. It is important to note that the Great Depression was much longer than previous depressions. There has been a business cycle for centuries, really, with a depression or recession hitting every 10 or 15 years, but generally they lasted a year or two. The Great Depression essentially lasted a decade, so it's unparalleled. It's pretty clear that the policies of Herbert Hoover at the beginning of that depression made it worse. But what about the policies of Roosevelt? Well, that's more debatable. But no surprise, in the midterm election in 1938, Republicans make some pretty major gains. We could see it here, picking up 81 House seats, particularly in their old strongholds in the northern tier of states. Democrats had gained a lot of House seats there in the two previous elections, but the Republicans clawed many of them back. They also noted in the popular vote, pretty much even, which was quite different from previous elections. And the Republicans make gains in the Senate as well, picking up 4 seats, with the progressives taking Wisconsin, their stronghold as well. Regardless of whether Roosevelt's policies prolonged the Depression, certainly many of the New Deal programs that he instituted were very popular. Social Security would be a great example. But another example would be rural electrification. Previously, cities and towns had electricity, but most farms in rural areas did not. And through the Rural Electrification Administration, electric lines were laid out, a lot of co-ops were created, and electricity was essentially brought across the country. From talking to my parents and parents-in-law, all of whom were alive at this time and all of whom lived in farms in the western United States, I talk a lot about just how transformative it was to have electricity, both domestically and for the farm economies. 1938, war is looming in Europe, and 1939 it breaks out. That's beneficial for the U.S. economy. That's really what sort of ends the Great Depression. There's such a huge need for American war material and agricultural goods and other products. So unemployment goes way down. It bolsters Roosevelt's position, as does concern about the coming war. People are getting nervous. Is this going to hit the United States? There was a lot of opposition for the U.S. going to war, partly because of the bad memories from World War I and its aftermath. Roosevelt's policy was to stay out of the war but prepare for its possibility and to help the Western allies to the extent possible. The notion of the U.S. as the arsenal of democracy. The Republicans at the time were deeply divided. They were desperate to reclaim their position and try to at least be competitive in the presidential election. They had not been in the previous elections. But they're divided between isolationists, those who want to stay out of the war if at all possible, and interventionists or internationalists, as they're also called, who not necessarily wanted war, but wanted to be prepared for the possibility of war and to do everything possible to aid the Allies fighting against Germany, Italy, and Japan. So I have the 4 leading Republican contenders for the nomination. I've color-coded it with the 2 isolationists, Robert Taft, also known as Mr. Republican of Ohio, Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan. I should note that once war does break out, they change their tune. Certainly Vandenberg did in a very big way. and then two internationalists or interventionists, Thomas Dewey of New York and Wendell Willkie. You can see in the map that Dewey does the best in the primary elections, winning Maryland, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Wisconsin, Nebraska. Others not doing nearly as well. Taft takes his native Ohio, and that is all. And in the convention, there was this upsurge of interest and enthusiasm for Willkie. He was an outsider, a fresh face, was not a politician, a businessman. A very unusual biography. His father was born in Germany and became, like many Germans, heavily involved in progressive republicanism, Republican Party. Young Wendell had sort of rebelled, read Karl Marx, became a socialist. Then he eventually became a Democrat, a New Deal Democrat. He became a corporate lawyer and a utilities executive. And that's one of the things that led him to turn against Franklin Roosevelt. He thought that Roosevelt was pushing the New Deal too hard, especially by taking over utilities, creating the Tennessee Valley Authority. Willkie didn't want the government competing in what he saw as the rightful private sector. So he becomes a Republican very late and runs for president without even running in the primaries, but does get the nomination. His campaign was relatively ineffective. One of the things he really campaigned on was the notion that a third term is un-American, we might even say. George Washington set the precedent of not running for a third term. Other presidents had followed suit, and it seemed unseemly for someone to try for a third term. It was a very brave campaign. Republicans were, by this time, very unpopular in working class areas. They were seen as anti-labor, well, for good reasons, anti-labor unions, I should say, and as responsible for the Depression because of the policies of Herbert Hoover and others. And Willkie was often pelted with fruit, but he marched on. But he did some flip-flopping, if you will. At first he said that Roosevelt was unprepared for war, which was a good possibility. Then later he said he was pushing too hard for war. So a rather incoherent campaign. It is important to note, though, that after he loses in 1940, a few years later, he publishes a blockbuster internationalist book. I'm internationalist in the full sense of the term, One World. Greatest non-fiction bestseller to date in U.S. history. Really a very left-wing book, advocating the end of European and American colonialism, advocating world federalism, full racial equality. That was big steps at the time. And inspired something called the World Federalist Movement. People as varied as Alfred Einstein and Mohandas Gandhi, Nehru of India, involved in that. But back to the election, he loses in 1940. Pretty decisively, popular vote 54 to 44. So it's not as big of a landslide as had happened in the two previous elections, but it's pretty much a landslide in the Electoral College. You could see taking only some traditional Republican strongholds in northern New England, the Great Plains region, Michigan, and Indiana as well. If you look at the county level map, it's a little bit more similar to the maps of the 1920s, although not in the West. The West, at this point, very strongly Democratic voting, which had not been true previously. There are definitely more blue counties in a lot of Midwestern states, but still quite a bit of red on the map. 1942, by this time, the United States is at war, early in the war. It's not going all that well. It's starting to turn, but still there was a lot of worry that the U.S. wasn't pursuing the war effort adequately, just sort of desire for change. And you could see the Republicans making big gains in the House of Representatives, 47 seats. And pretty much now Republicans have solid control over most of the North, with a few Democratic areas and a few progressive areas, but otherwise pretty much have a lock on it. The West is becoming more mixed. A similar story in the Senate. Republicans gained 9 seats, really returning to power in their traditional strongholds and making some sort of gains outside of that, places like Oklahoma. Uh, 1944, next election. Now, by this time, the war is definitely going in favor of the United States and the Allies. Both Germany and Japan are retreating rapidly. Roosevelt argued that this unprecedented fourth term was necessary because of the war. Needed a same hand on the tiller, an even course. One of the biggest concerns among pundits and the electorate was the state of Roosevelt's health. The press had done a rather astounding job of keeping his previous health problems from the public. I think most Americans didn't even know that he was essentially paralyzed from polio and couldn't walk. That was sort of an agreement not to show him in a wheelchair. But by this time, it was more serious issues. He had pretty serious hypertension and heart disease, was losing weight, looked very sickly. But as I say, it wasn't necessarily well known to everybody. Another important thing was he had dropped his controversial vice president, Henry Wallace. I'll talk about him later on. He was a presidential candidate in 1948. Wallace was quite far to the left at that time. Was seen as too leftist, really, for Roosevelt, so he dropped him and picked up Harry Truman, much more centrist, a politician from Kansas City, Missouri. There were many Republican contenders in this election, and you can see the primary map there. A lot of the contenders won their home state, Earl Warren in California or Harold Stassen in Minnesota. Nobody really had substantial support across a wide number of states. But the nomination eventually goes to Thomas Dewey, who had tried before. Seemed like a strong candidate. He's relatively moderate, part of the internationalist or interventionist wing, which is the wing of the Republican Party that is now dominant because of the war. Dewey himself had started out as a New York City prosecutor and DA. He successfully went after organized crime, even to the extent of prosecuting Lucky Luciano. A lot of people thought that would have been impossible, but he did it. And as a governor, he was noted for a lot of progressive policies, expanding New York's infrastructure, creating the SUNY system of state universities, noted for some progressive labor reforms and housing and public health initiatives, civil rights. But he was also quite a fiscal conservative, the traditional Republican selling point that he was not going to overtax. He was going to keep government within limits. But Roosevelt wins yet again. And the Democrats gain seats in the House, some 22, although the Republicans gained one Senate seat, so it was a little more mixed in Congress. But a clear victory again, and in terms of the Electoral College, still pretty much a landslide. If we look at the map, not much change from the previous map, so I won't dwell on this, but the Republicans did make some gains in the West and Midwest. In April, note the headline here, Roosevelt dies, Truman in office, and Yanks reported within 16 miles of Berlin. So the war in Europe was essentially over, was not over in the Pacific, and it is Truman who is going to go on to approve the nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. So Truman is in office when the war is finished. And when the war does end in 1945, there is a brief but quite a sharp recession. And the recession was particularly bad because of the psychological effect. A lot of people thought that the U.S. might just slip back into depression. I mean, that depression had lasted so long, and it only ended because of World War II increasing demand and resulting in full employment. But there had been a lot of privation during the war. A lot of things were rationed. Wages did not go up. And quite soon, there's a tremendous amount of labor unrest. Big strikes in 1945, 46. I mean, some huge ones. You can see 340,000 coal miners striking in April 1946. A lot of people are concerned about this. Truman's approval rating sinks all the way down to 32%, which is quite low. And in the same year, Republicans not only make major gains in the House, they take control of the House. You could see this time, go back and compare that with 1936 when the Democrats just had an overwhelming majority in the House. And now the Republicans have 246 to 188. And you can see on the map how we're going back to the sort of north-south pattern, at least in the eastern part of the country, although the west is a bit more mixed. But the Republicans are making major gains in the west as well. And the Senate, in one way, that means even more extreme. You see the Republicans take control of the Senate with 51 seats, the Democrats 45, gaining seats all the way across the northern tier of states, even down into Missouri, home state of the president, Harry Truman. So with the Republicans having strong power in the House and Senate, and with all this labor unrest going on, the Republicans respond by restricting the power of labor unions. The Taft-Hartley Act, Robert Taft of Ohio, one of the creators of this. Truman vetoed it, called it a slave labor bill, but it was the veto was overridden. Unions, as you can see in the headline, unions to fight for a quick repeal, which does not happen. And I'm not going to go through all the provisions. It certainly doesn't eliminate labor unions, but it reins them in. So there has to be a cooling off periods for any strikes that affect the national interest. Union leadership with communist affiliation was banned. You couldn't have closed shops, only open to labor unions. The unions could be liable for damages. Restrictions on wildcat strikes and political activities of unions. So it really did constrict union power, which was very closely tied in with the Democratic Party at this time. So as we go into 1948, things looked really bad for Harry Truman. The Republicans in charge of Congress, low approval rating, this big anti-labor bill just passing. Inflation is still, it's pretty high, 7.7%. Meanwhile, there are a lot of foreign policy setbacks. The Soviet Union is advancing in Europe. The communists in China, the Maoist revolutionary movement is advancing and is going to take over China in the next year. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party splits three ways. Truman gets challenges from both the left and right, as indicated in the political cartoon here, with him riding the Democratic donkey divided in two parts. So 48, one of the most interesting and consequential elections in U.S. history. So we have Truman, a Democrat, and Thomas Dewey, again, the Republican. And then you have Henry Wallace, former Secretary of Agriculture, former Vice President under FDR, who bolts from the Democratic Party. He says it's become too reactionary. He's particularly opposed to Truman's policies, anti-Soviet policies. I'll show you that on a slide later on. So Wallace would be called the left-wing progressive here. But then on the Democratic right wing, and many Democrats in the South were very conservative at this time, you have Strom Thurmond withdrawing to form the States' Rights Party, or Dixiecrat Party, as it was often called. And this States' Rights Party, or Dixiecrat Party, was came about in the 1948 Democratic Convention, where the Democrats adopted for the first time a strong civil rights platform, pushed by Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota in particular. And you can see the vote on that strong civil rights platform. Northern states, almost all of them voted yes, except for Maine and New Hampshire, although a little bit divided. And a few in the West, it's a number of Western states. But otherwise, in the eastern half of the country, it's basically a north-south division, pretty close to the old slave state, free state division on this very, very important issue. So a little bit more is important to say about Henry Wallace. Like I say, an enigmatic figure. He was an agricultural writer and entrepreneur. He came from a family that was involved in agricultural publications. He was involved in the hybrid corn seed industry, very knowledgeable about agriculture. He had been a Republican, but in the Depression shifted to the Democrats and then shifted farther to the left. And in 1948, he advocated conciliatory policies towards the Soviet Union. He thought that Truman was pushing the Cold War much too hard. We should try to come to terms and agreement with the Soviet Union. It was also in favor of desegregation, even more so than the main Democratic platform, racial and gender equality, national health insurance. Actually, Truman wanted national health insurance as well, but it's not going to come his way. But sorry for the misspelling there. But in 1952, this is way after the election, he visits the Soviet Union and was not fooled, did not like what he saw, and denounced it as utterly evil. Sort of withdrew from many of his previous positions and successfully returns to agribusiness. So it really looked dim for Harry Truman. Almost everybody thought he would lose, but he decides to fight back. Give him hell, Harry. Evidently, Truman had a fairly salty language, which was not considered by many appropriate at the time, but he decided to embrace that. Truman denounces what he called the Do-Nothing Congress, claiming that it has done less than nothing. They don't know whether they're driving a bus or chasing one. Not entirely accurate. They did things, but a lot of the things they had done he didn't like. And he pushed what he called the Fair Deal. So you'd had the New Deal. If you go back to earlier, you had Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal. But now we have the Fair Deal, and it would involve things like national health insurance, enhanced educational support, fair employment practices. In other words, pushing the New Deal agenda of Roosevelt several steps further. He also emphasized, though, at the same time, his anti-communism, sort of fighting against the Wallace challenge. So he had the Truman Doctrine to try to prevent further Soviet expansionism, and the Marshall Plan, which involved pouring a lot of money into Western Europe to shore up devastated economies and fledgling democracies. And he also argued that a Republican victory could easily bring back the Depression. This was still a big fear in many people's minds, and the Great Depression was very much associated with the policies of Herbert Hoover and the Republican Party at the time. But it didn't turn out how most people thought that it would. You had pretty good polling at this time. George Gallup sort of developed his scientific polling in mid-1930s, and was famed for predicting Roosevelt's landslide victory over Alf Landon in 1936. But the polls were completely off at this time. Interesting cartoon with Dewey and Truman, and Dewey saying, "Oh, what's the use of even going through with the election?" One other thing I should note is Dewey did not conduct a very effective campaign either. He was very hesitant about making strong policies. He just sort of wanted to rely on the unpopularity of the incumbent. It didn't win. We can see one of the most famous newspaper headlines in the history of publishing. Dewey defeats Truman, Truman holding it, because the newspaper editors were just so sure that Dewey was going to win that they went ahead and printed it, but did not. In fact, Truman won relatively easily. These two challenges from the left and right wing of the Democratic Party didn't amount to much. Henry Wallace won only about 2.5% of the vote, didn't take any states. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina with the Dixiecrat or States' Rights Party did much better in the Electoral College, as you can see here, winning South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, getting one electoral vote in Tennessee, but only not doing well in the popular vote at all. Thomas Dewey doing reasonably well, about how he had done before, but certainly nothing close to a victory. It took most of the Northeast, you could see, except Massachusetts and Rhode Island, traditional Republican strongholds, and some traditional Republican strongholds in states like Michigan and Indiana, Great Plains states. But Truman doing very well across the West, Midwest, South, and winning quite handily. One other thing I want to mention in this lecture, I'm almost done, but would be Thomas Dewey's running mate, Earl Warren. So Earl Warren, a very interesting and controversial figure. So he had been California, a progressive Republican governor. I've talked a lot in this class about how strong the progressive Republican movement was in California. Oh, not always Republican. So Hiram Johnson, well-known California progressive governor, who was actually the vice presidential candidate of Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 under the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. But Warren was part of this progressive Republican establishment. He did some things that would hardly be regarded as progressive today, such as pushing the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, although he later really expressed regret for having done that. But what I find really interesting is that he is going to, you can see he's appointed Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court by Dwight Eisenhower, Republican president in the 1950s, and leads what is really a revolutionarily liberal Supreme Court, the Warren Court. All sorts of landmark decisions made, like Brown versus the Board of Education against racial segregation laws, Reynolds versus Sims, which said that state legislatures must create districts that reflect population. Previously, most state legislatures had an upper house that was based on territory rather than population, much like the U.S. Senate is based on territory rather than population, which gave extra sort of control to rural areas, which often tended to be more conservative. Now, today they're very much more conservative. That wasn't necessarily true earlier. Sometimes rural districts were quite liberal or on the left. But certainly it was a system that did not sort of fairly represent population. The one person, one vote idea is really what informs this decision. Miranda versus Arizona. I'm sure everyone's heard of the Miranda rights that police have to read to people. Another very interesting case, Loving versus Virginia, which overturned laws against interracial marriage or miscegenation, which were common in the South. Or even Griswold versus Connecticut, overturning laws against contraceptives on the basis of the right to privacy, which would later be used in Roe v. Wade on abortion, which was, of course, overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2022, I believe. But anyway, Griswold versus Connecticut is certainly held. So even though Earl Warren was a Republican and was nominated, brought into the Supreme Court by a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, right-wing Republicans came to hate him. And as the Republican Party turned sharply to the right in the early 1960s, we'll talk about that in the next lecture, with Barry Goldwater being nominated, that wing of the Republican Party came to just despise Earl Warren. I'm old enough to remember these kind of billboards, which were common in California at the time, impeach Earl Warren. So there was a lot of talk about that. Nothing came of it. And finally, in our last slide, I just want to show the county level map. And one thing it just really clearly shows is how much individual states matter. So you could see Strom Thurmond in there, the Dixiecrat, just taking virtually every county in South Carolina. I believe, I have to look more closely, it looks like every county in Alabama and Mississippi. Remember, this is a time when blacks were essentially not allowed to vote in the Deep South. So you could just see the real change at the state line, because you had state party sort of establishments that sort of went kind of hand in glove with them. But it's not everywhere in the South. You could see in other southern states a very little support for this, with most areas remaining with the Democratic Party, which had been the party representing the South. Otherwise, some pretty clear patterns here. The Republicans are gaining strength in much of the West. That's interesting to look at a state like Montana at this time, when the southern counties were largely Republican, and the northern sort of wheat growing belt mostly Democratic. That would remain for many years, and its final legacy is just sort of coming to an end right now, with Democrat John Tester just having lost the Senate election in Montana. His support previously had been pretty strong in a lot of those northern agricultural counties, as well as mining counties, counties with major universities and so on. I'll talk about some of those patterns later on. You can also see at this time how blue Minnesota is. Minnesota is becoming the most solidly Democratic Party, and it's going to maintain that position. In 1984, it was the only state to vote for Democratic candidate Walter Mondale. But we'll talk about those patterns in later lectures. So we'll pick up the story with the next lecture with 1952 and the election of Dwight Eisenhower. So thank you for listening, and I hope you can tune into further lectures.